So why not become a Roman Catholic? Well, for one thing, the papacy is of the essence of Roman Catholicism. And you remember last time I said, please don't assume that everything that happened in the church prior to the 16th century can be classified as Roman Catholic. Now, I'm going to make a bold claim, but I can defend it, and that is, and I want you to hear me right when I say this, the Roman Catholic Church did not come into existence properly until the 13th century. The Roman Catholic Church, now this is a bit of hyperbole, but I say this to get my students' attention. The Roman Catholic Church is a 16th century Italian sect. Now, as I say, that's hyperbole. It's more complicated than that. But if I had to choose between the claim that the Roman Catholic Church is the ancient Western or even universal expression of the Catholic Church, lowercase c, universal church, and Roman Catholicism is a 16th century Italian sect, right? That's much closer to the truth than the claim that Roman Catholicism is the ancient expression of Christianity, either in the West or universally in the West and the East. That is simply not true. So I mentioned the papacy. No one can be a Roman Catholic who denies the papacy. The papacy is so of the essence of Roman Catholicism, so central to Roman Catholicism, so central to what Rome believes, the way Rome is structured. When I say Rome, I mean Roman Catholicism, and the theology of the Roman Catholic Church, the piety of the Roman Catholic Church, and the practice of the Roman Catholic Church, that were we to remove the papacy, there would be no Roman Catholic Church. It's that essential. And it's not we, Protestants, we Reformation types, we Reformed confessionalists who made the papacy essential to Roman Catholicism. Rome made the papacy essential to Roman Catholicism. So it's not our doing at all. This is something that, in effect, Rome has done to herself. Now, why is that important? Because in the ancient church, in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, and really, for all intents and purposes, in the 4th century, with one minor exception, we'll come back to that, Damasus I, in I think about AD 340, did claim to be Papa. He was the first Roman bishop to claim to be the Pope. So now, that doesn't mean that he actually was the Pope or that anybody else regarded him as the Pope, but he did claim that. So in the 4th century, it gets to be a little more complicated. But in the 2nd century, that is the century immediately following the close of the Apostolic Age, which probably ends sometime in the AD 90s. So the 1st century is essentially, AD or 1 to AD 99. The Apostle John, as far as anyone knows, was the last apostle to die, and some people assume he died on Patmos. Others think he didn't. For the purposes of this discussion, it doesn't really matter exactly where he died or even exactly when he died, but that he most likely died sometime in the 90s. I think the best scholarship, for example, on the Revelation, and I take that to be something that was written, a book that was written by the Apostle John, and that probably dates to about AD 92 or 93. So by the end of the 90s, end of the 1st century, right, that's the end of the Apostolic Age. There are no more living apostles by the turn of the calendar from the 1st century to the 2nd. So when I say the 2nd century, I mean AD 100, right, until AD 199 or something like that. So there is, and here's the material point, there's no papacy in the 2nd century. I read the Fathers a lot. I teach 2 courses on the Fathers, have done for many years, and there just is no evidence of a papacy in the 2nd century. Nobody's talking about a papacy. Nobody's talking about the Apostle Peter as pope. Nobody's looking for a pope. Nobody's claiming to be a pope. We don't even know who the alleged successors are with absolute certainty to Peter, because there are two succession lists. One of them, right, lists I'll put it this way. One has one successor. I think one of them has Linus. And again, I'm doing this from memory. One has another successor, but they don't agree, which is the material point. Now, if Peter really were regarded in the New Testament as the first pope, and again, we have no evidence from the New Testament whatever for that, not a shred. Nobody in the New Testament speaks of Peter as pope. Peter doesn't speak as pope. Paul writes to Rome without any reference to Peter, and were Peter the pope, he certainly would have at least mentioned, made some greeting to Peter. And again, I'm not one of those who thinks that Peter was never in Rome. I think he probably was, but it doesn't make him pope. And he didn't stay necessarily in Rome. He was probably there traditionally in the very early 40s, and I think Mark probably wrote his gospel after Peter was there, so around 44, 45, AD 44, 45. But be that as may, nobody in the New Testament's thinking about Peter as pope. Nobody in the New Testament's talking about Peter as pope. Most importantly, we have two epistles from Peter, and he never describes himself as pope. He doesn't expect us to think of him as pope. He describes himself in different ways, but pope is not one of them. Holy Father is not one of them. Vicar of Christ on the earth is not one of them. And again, you don't see anything like that in the New Testament. And you don't see anything of that sort of language in the post-apostolic church of the 2nd century. You don't see it in Tertullian, which gets us into the 3rd century. But if you look at the Apostolic Fathers. So if you were to look at the Apostolic Fathers, and I have my copy of Holmes's 3rd edition of the Apostolic Fathers that I've been using in the patristic seminar for, I don't know, most of, certainly for 20 years. And if you look at the Apostolic Fathers, which is, by the way, a sort of arbitrary collection of early church writers from the early part of the 2nd century, AD 110 or so, and early church documents from about AD 110 to probably 150, 160 or so, maybe a little later when you think about the shepherd, for example. But that maybe you could pretty safely say, I guess 150. But First Clement, okay, that could be sub 100. So that's a very early document, and people regularly date it in the 90s. So we don't even know who Clement is. We don't know who wrote this letter. Probably, I'm convinced he's a layman. He's a ruling elder or something like that. He's not a trained pastor or theologian. And there are reasons for that, and we don't have time to get into all that. But at least traditionally, it has been thought that he wrote from Rome. Nothing in here about a pope. And if there was a papacy, you would have expected, wouldn't you, some mention of the Holy Father, the Vicar of Christ on the earth, but nothing in First Clement. Second Clement probably comes from Alexandria, but again, nothing about the papacy. Ignatius, who was a regional pastor, a regional bishop, not the way we think. When I hate to say bishop because that we load that word up with all kinds of ideas that don't exist yet in the 2nd century, but these letters probably date around AD 115. Again, nothing in here about any kind of hierarchy of bishops, and nothing in Ignatius, the letters of Ignatius, 7 of them, about a papacy. And there's a letter to the church in Rome, and nothing about the papacy. Nothing in the martyrdom of Polycarp about a Roman bishop. nothing in the Didache, which is partly an moral instruction manual and partly a church order. And you'd think maybe in the section that is the church order, that there'd be something about a pope or a papacy. Nothing. Nothing in the Epistle of Barnabas, dated to about AD 120. Nothing in Barnabas about a papacy. My least favorite document in the Apostolic Fathers is the Shepherd of Hermas, because it's just crazy. There are reasons why it was so popular, and it was wildly popular. It's a sort of apocalyptic nomism. But again, nothing here about a papacy. And the church is absolutely central to Hermas, or the shepherd. And the visible institutional church is very important, central really to the Shepherd of Hermas, and probably the reason that it was so widely or well regarded, for example, by Polycarp, among others, but nothing about the papacy. One of our earliest defenses of the faith, it's called the Epistle to Diognetus. It probably isn't an epistle. It's probably a speech. But be that as it may, it dates to about AD 150, and it was a speech probably given to a Roman official. At least that's my reconstruction. And nothing about a papacy, nothing in the fragments of Papias about a papacy. So these are the texts that were gathered together in the 17th century and called the Apostolic Fathers. Nothing in the Apologists, nothing in Justin from about AD 150 about a papacy, nothing in Irenaeus, right? Against heresies, for example, nothing in there about a papacy. And you just don't find anything in the 2nd century about a papacy. So, this is an argument from silence, but in this case, it's a compelling argument from silence. It just doesn't exist. Nobody's thinking about it. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody mentions it. There's just no evidence that it exists in the 2nd century. How can you have a situation where Christ allegedly made Peter the rock on which the church is built, and nobody knows anything about it until a Roman bishop begins to make a contested claim in the 4th century? And really nobody's thinking in terms of a papacy in any real sense until the 7th century. I mean, really, that's probably too early. I mean, the only, or the first figure in the ancient church who begins to exercise something like real papal authority and begins to be seen as something like what we think of as a pope is Gregory the Great. And in an argument with a metropolitan from the Eastern Church, Gregory said anyone who calls himself the universal vicar of Christ on the earth is Antichrist, which is the fundamental central claim of the papacy. And we in the Reformed churches agree with Gregory that anybody who calls himself the universal vicar of Christ on the earth is Antichrist. That's right. So the very office of the papacy, I'm not talking about the person necessarily of the Pope, although I think it's probably been the case if you know the history of the papacy. There certainly have been men, occupants of the office of the papacy, who were Antichrist. But the office itself is Antichrist by Gregory's standards. There's no real papacy in the church. You could say the 9th century with Leo, but papacy doesn't become what we think of as the papacy really until the 13th century, which is why I say you can arguably call the 13th century the really formative century for the development of the papacy. And there are a lot of other reasons why the papacy, from a biblical point of view, is absurd, but also from a historical point of view, is highly problematic. And that's because for big chunks of time in the history of the Western Church, it's not been entirely clear who was the legitimate heir, to grant the premise that the Roman bishop was the heir of Peter as the universal vicar of Christ over the earth. It wasn't clear who was the Pope and who was the quote-unquote anti-Pope. Do you know how many anti-popes there have been in the history of the church? By the reckoning of the Church of Rome, I'm not sure off the top of my head the exact number, but it's in the dozens. I think I can safely say that. As I say, in the 14th century and into the 15th century, for better part of 100 years, there was an open question as to whether it was the Avignon Pope or the Roman Pope, and then for a few years, a Pope in Pisa, so that at one time there were 3 people all claiming, or each claiming to be the universal vicar of Christ on the earth. And each one of them had, in different ways, legitimate arguments. So the history of the papacy is much more complicated than most people know. The history of the papacy is much darker than most people know. There's a fun collection of stories called The Bad Popes, and that's an illuminating collection. Even J.N.D. Kelly's little dictionary of popes, and Kelly, I don't think is particularly hostile to the papacy. I think he was I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if J.N.D. Kelly was Roman Catholic. I don't think so. I think of him as an Anglican of some sort. Certainly not as a low church Anglican. I don't know, maybe Anglo-Catholic. But at any rate, and a really fine scholar, one of my really favorite scholars of all time, I guess, J.N.D. Kelly. His dictionary of popes is marvelous, and I love it because he tells the truth. He doesn't gild the lily at all. Well, at any rate, the absence of the papacy in the 2nd century is a huge problem. And of course, the utter lack of exegetical support for the papacy in the text of the New Testament, I think, is insurmountable. So if you're thinking about converting to Roman Catholicism, you're not going to do it for intellectual reasons. If you're being honest, you're doing it for something else. And as I said last time, frequently it's people looking for a place to park their implicit faith. And our case is that Holy Scripture is where you park your implicit faith. There are things about Scripture that I don't understand or can't explain, but I trust Scripture, even though I can't necessarily explain everything. I don't have any confidence that I know what the Nephilim were. I don't think I need to know what they were. It's not really material to the faith, frankly. It's an interesting question, but it seems to me to be largely speculative. There are probably other things that I don't entirely understand, but I don't need to understand them because I can understand what I need to know for the Christian faith and the Christian life. I know who God is. I know who Christ is. I know what he said. I know what he did. I know what I am. I know what grace is. I know what the good news is. I know what the law is. And I know what the history of salvation is. I know what the promises are. All those things I can clearly discern from Holy Scripture because Scripture was intended for those things to be clear. It's sufficiently clear. Determining all of that from the magisterial teaching of the Roman Catholic Church is much more difficult. And the more you read, the more you learn, it becomes remarkably difficult sometimes to figure out exactly what is the authoritative doctrine, dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. But we'll stop with this point. If there's no papacy, and the historical claims of the papacy are exceeding difficult, then one of the fundamental pillars of Roman Catholicism is in grave jeopardy.